did engineering science at Penn State, which is kind of similar to systems engineering, and then got my master's at Princeton, PhD at University of Colorado Boulder, uh, did energy efficiency consulting, then taught in Nashville for a few years and Alaska for 4.5 years, hence my Northern Lights background. And then I've been in New Zealand for about 2.5 years. And I'm associate professor in mechanical engineering at University of Canterbury, and also co-founder and research director of Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, or ALLFED. So I'll be talking about ALLFED's work, research, policy, piloting, and next steps. And I'll be going pretty quickly to save some time for questions at the end. So ALLFED mission is to increase resilience to global catastrophes, and motto is feeding everyone no matter what. People on ALLFED are on all continents except for Antarctica, and we have people on our board from places like Oxford and Cambridge. Also, Jan Taulen, co-founder of Skype. So what is global catastrophic food failure? Well, one example was 1816, Tambora volcanic eruption caused famines in different parts of the world, also inspired the writing of Frankenstein. And so a GCFF is where we have a widespread supply shortage that's beyond the traditional coping capacity. And that might be something like an abrupt 5% loss in food production or more. And so looking at the spectrum of catastrophes, there are conventional disasters, which are localized or expected relatively slow climate change. And these are problems, and it's good that people are working on them. But that's not what ALLFED focuses on. So instead, we focus on larger catastrophes, and I'll get into more details, but they can involve things that disrupt sunlight, like the volcano, or kill crops directly, like diseases, or disrupt infrastructure. So losing about 10% of food production abruptly has one UK government report estimated that just from extreme weather on multiple continents at the same time, that has about an 80% chance this century. But then you add on things like volcanoes and asteroid impacts and crop disease and weeds that are resistant to pesticides, loss of pollinators, nuclear war that could cause burning of cities and smoke going into the atmosphere, or pandemic potentially disrupting food trade or the farming process, and it really adds up. So even though these really high severity catastrophes are less likely, when you put them all together, they're quite likely to happen at some point this century. So first I'll talk about what we call abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios. And an extreme one here is a full-scale nuclear war causing nuclear winter. This is about a 10 degrees Celsius global temperature drop and around 70 or 80% reduction in sunlight globally and reduced precipitation. And crop production in the worst year is about 90% globally. And 150 teragrams is 150 million tons of soot or black carbon placed into the stratosphere. So what would that look like? Well, if we look at the yield, tons per hectare of food produced, It's been steadily increasing over the last 60 or so years. But if we had this extreme nuclear winter, the yield would go back basically before the Industrial Revolution. So massive shock and just in a couple years. And unsurprisingly, the default here would be global famine, though Australia and New Zealand actually look pretty good. And so how can we make this better? Well, I'll go into the different technologies, but here's kind of a big picture of abrupt sunlight reduction scenario, or ASRS, collapse of crops, and then we'll talk about what we call resilient foods that can make the situation much better. And so they include things that are more conventional, like crops that like cool temperatures, and mushrooms, but also some more exotic things like turning wood into sugar, greenhouses turning hydrogen or methane into protein, or leaves into protein, or growing seaweed. And so if we can respond quickly, we can make the situation much better. This is without global trade. Yellow is good, meeting all the needs, so many more countries could feed themselves. So one resilient food is seaweed that can be grown pretty low tech, just having ropes held up by buoys. And we did some cost modeling of how much food we could produce. Here on the top, you could see the percentage of human global caloric needs, and it would be pretty affordable, up to maybe 30% of caloric needs. Not saying that most people would eat 30% of their calories from seaweed, but it could also be used as animal feed or potentially as biofuels. And here are some photos looking at seaweed production. Here are these ropes with buoys. And zooming out, you can see many ropes and many buoys. And then zooming out further, basically covering an entire bay in China with seaweed. And we looked at where the seaweed would grow best in ASRS. That's the dark green areas. So crop relocation, crops like canola, rapeseed, barley, wheat, turnips, potatoes like cool temperatures, so they would do well. We looked at scaling up greenhouses rapidly. In just a few years, we might be able to feed everyone with this solution, and that allows you to grow food that needs warmer temperatures. So we've done some what we call the integrated model of looking at how different resilient foods interact. And here you can see the dairy is white, meat is red, outdoor crops consumed immediately is green. Then we might produce some crops and store them after the catastrophe. And then we could also use stored food at the beginning of the catastrophe. And this is a global scenario assuming trade. And kilocalories per person per day, generally you need around 2,100. So if you can do some simple adaptations like reducing food waste and reducing biofuels and food fed to animals, you can make the situation much better, but still you're only providing about half the calories that are needed. Whereas if you add these resilient foods, seaweed, greenhouses, methane, single cell protein, this is microbes that actually eat natural gas, and we can eat the microbes. And cellulosic sugar that's turning wood and residues into sugar. Then you can see we can actually meet 109% of global needs. This doesn't include cropland expansion, but that's another option that we could potentially plant crops where we're not planting them. And a lot of that would be areas where we're grazing right now. And I'll skip some of the details, but uh, we think that we could clear quite a bit of cropland, and we wouldn't be clearing the old growth forests with the big biodiversity impacts here. It's mainly like young forests or grazing land. And we think that in a year or so, we might be able to scale up to tens of percent of global food needs met by expanding area, even in one of these catastrophic sunlight reduction scenarios. Mushrooms don't need sunlight, so they can grow on residues. Uh, you notice the milk production in our integrated model. That's assuming that we have cows that eat grass on areas that are not fit for producing crops. Insects is another option. A lot of insects now are produced on human edible food, which wouldn't be a very good idea, but they could potentially eat uh, things that we can't eat. Leaf protein concentrate is where you take leaves, can be like alfalfa, or it can be even crops, and grind them up, squeeze out the green liquid, and boil the liquid, and you get a leaf protein concentrate. That can be done at household scale, and we've done that at ALLFED, but it can also be done industrial scale. So then moving on to food without agriculture. So this is using CO2 or potentially fossil fuels or wood. Could also be a potential source of vitamins. So here are a few different options. Um, the hydrogen SCP is microbes that eat hydrogen, but they also need a carbon source, so you typically use CO2 for that. You can also just directly turn a feedstock into food without any biological organism. And so that's the synthetic fat can actually use a waste product from petroleum processing for that. Then we've done some cost effectiveness work, both in terms of saving lives in the present generation and also increasing the value of the long-term future by, say, preventing collapse of civilization. And we we think on the saving lives that it's getting prepared for these catastrophes is a very cost-effective way of saving lives, even when you take into account that the catastrophe might not happen. And we have a couple papers on this. We've also been evaluated by other organizations, and the latest one that was external, I believe, came up with about $150 to save a life, which is way, way cheaper than most other options. All right, so moving on to these infrastructure collapse scenarios. So this could be a solar storm that could disrupt electricity. It could be high altitude detonation of nuclear weapons causing electromagnetic pulse, known as HEMPs. It could be a cyber attack that could be enabled by AI that has disrupted electricity before, but it could be over a much greater area. Or it could be a pandemic where people are unable or unwilling to show up to work in critical industries like electricity. And then losing electricity cascades to other essential services. So we asked the question, can you feed everyone without modern infrastructure and industry? And so on the food side, we looked at some key crops and then asked, well, what if we disrupt the supply of fertilizer, particularly artificial fertilizer, pesticides, um, mechanical power, and irrigation? And what we found was that in areas that have high yields of agricultural production now, then they are going to have a bigger problem. They're going to have a greater percent loss in their production uh, by losing these agricultural inputs. But if we lose infrastructure, it's not just a matter of food. There are also other needs like transporting food and other essential goods. And so we actually have a project looking at uh, retrofitting ships to be wind powered. And that could be a kite, could be traditional sails, could be rotating Flettner rotors. Happy to get into details if people are interested. Uh, then, in particular, on pandemics, this case of worker shortages, we've looked at, well, if we had an extreme pandemic, maybe 10 times as bad as COVID or really extreme, like as infectious as measles, but as uh, fatal as rabies without a vaccine, then you would need really good PPE, sometimes called P4E, pandemic proof personal protective equipment. But unfortunately, we don't have very much of it, and it just wouldn't be enough to cover the vital workers to keep electricity, energy, food, and water going. And so we're looking at can we rapidly scale up other ways of reducing pandemic transmission? And one of them is UV. So the there are these systems in use now. They're typically called upper room ultraviolet systems because we don't want regular ultraviolet getting in people's eyes and giving sunburns. Um, and so we're looking at how fast we could scale that up. Maybe we could retrofit fluorescent bulb manufacturing to actually produce UV bulbs. Then there's in-room filtration. These are called Corsi-Rosenthal boxes, where you just have a box fan and a couple panel filters, pretty cheap and work quite well. Then there's also increasing ventilation, which is easier than doing filters. Just have a big fan on the windows. But the problem is if it's really hot or really cold outside, then you have to keep people comfortable. And I've done a little experiment on this on myself because my office would often get to 10 degrees in the morning. But I found with heavy clothing and walking on my treadmill desk half the time, I felt comfortable. We're also going to be looking at can we provide temporary housing for workers to keep them isolated when they're not working. And we want to translate this work into policy, encourage governments to do plans to respond quickly in these catastrophes. So we've done a few plans for different governments, including Argentina, Australia, and um, most recently Singapore. There's another group of people in New Zealand who are looking at New Zealand specific response, and ALLFED has collaborated with them. So Argentina, which did get endorsement from the government, we talked about a spectrum of options to respond, including lower tech and higher tech. And then let's see if this works. So another project did well here in New Zealand was, I don't know if the sound's coming through. I can hear it. So you
Um,
can see we are pulling power off the back wheel of the car, and that's powering this wood chipper. All right, I think you get the idea. And and then the idea is that once you have these wood chips, you can put them in a tank and heat them up, and it makes wood gas. And then that wood gas can go into the car engine to power it. And this was actually done in World War II when they were running out of fuel, but has also been done by people with modern cars. We weren't able to do the actual wood gasification part because of safety concerns, but we did calculate based on other people's experiments that we one car could produce enough wood chips to power four cars. And then we also demonstrated that potentially the other three cars, they could be used for transporting goods, or we showed that one car could produce 20 kilowatts of electricity, which is more than 20 houses worth of electricity. So we want to do more experiments and pilots, proving out greenhouses. In particular, we can use a greenhouse to simulate nuclear winter conditions, say in the Australian interior, where currently not growing crops, but even though there'd be less precipitation, because it's colder, the plants would evaporate less and also higher relative humidity. So we think we might actually be able to grow crops in some places where we can't grow them now. And for greenhouses, we're interested in scaling up extruders to make the covers. And for seaweed, we need to twist a lot more rope. And then also we can think of larger industrial pilots, like to demonstrate uh, repurposing paper factory to uh, producing sugar. And we found that paper factory already has 85% of the equipment we need to turn wood into sugar. So this is the Australia pilot. I'm going to skip over some of the things here. There are different crop models that give different results of whether this would work or not. So we want to actually try it in the field. Skip over these. Here are some potential areas that two different crop models thought were promising. Another thing we're really concerned about with loss of electricity and infrastructure is losing communications. And without communications, there may just be chaos. So we have worked with another nonprofit that has actually already launched a very small CubeSat with the goal of communicating to individual cell phones. Now, you may have heard of companies that have said they're going to have actual cell phone calls supported through satellites on regular cell phones, so not the really expensive satellite phones. But it's really hard to have two-way communication. You need a really big satellite. So what we're looking at is with a small satellite, just doing one-way emergency information. Um, but what we need to do is eventually make that satellite resilient to things like solar storms and nuclear detonations. And that's going to cost more money. And if you have one satellite in polar orbit, it can communicate to all areas in the world at least once a day. So to wrap up, there are a lot of routes to disruption of food supply and other basic needs. And if you have a global catastrophe, you can't just rely on help from outside, which is how we deal with regular disasters. And so we need a portfolio of resilient food solutions, low tech and high tech, depending on your circumstance. And we need this to be translated into policy and plans so that we can scale this up quickly. So how can you help? Well, we're looking for people who have experience related to policy or coding or agriculture or making pilots. I'm also recruiting for PhD students, and we're also funding constrained. So lots of further resources, but I think I'll wrap it up and take questions.
That's great. Thanks so much, David. A really interesting topic and almost infinitely broad and deep as well. So can imagine the scoping conversations at the start of these kind of some of the engagements must be quite challenging to get a shared understanding of what you should be focusing on. There's a couple of good questions in the chat, so I'll start there. The first one's from Catherine Thompson. And so Catherine's asking how much reduction in sunlight is being considered catastrophic. So there's still plenty of sunlight that's still needed to grow things like seaweed and grass and turnips and other things.
Yeah, so the lower end that might be a 5 or 10% reduction in food supply, uh, I believe that's also 5 or 10% reduction in sunlight. I'm not sure exactly, but in that ballpark. And in that case, it is true that we could just reduce food waste and food fed to animals and biofuels and feed everyone. But our concern is that if that happens, food prices would go up so much that hundreds of millions of people might not be able to afford it. So I think we still need to do some preparation for those scenarios to get that goal of feeding everyone no matter what.
Great, thank you. The next one's from Luke Fisher. So Luke's had to jump off, but his question is just around, there's a lot of rhetoric from people like Musk around the need to become a multi-planetary species in order to survive. And so Luke's keen for your view on kind of that rhetoric and whether you share those same views.
Yeah, I do think that for certain catastrophes, um, having a self-sustaining population on another planet would provide more resilience. So, for instance, extreme volcano or asteroid impact. My concern is that in order for, say, Mars to be self-sustaining, the population would need to be fairly large. This is something I'm interested in, and I think other people are working on, what that population might be. Um, but it's going to be a massive investment to get that many people there. So I don't think it's going to protect us from risks in the next 10 or so years. And so we've focused on things that could happen in the next 10 or so years, and then we can reevaluate when things change. But yeah, I think in the long term, yeah, you definitely do get more resilience by going to other planets.
Great, thanks. The next one's from Karina. So going back to calorie needs for the population, did you take into account any reduction in population during the first year of less than 100% caloric needs met? Sorry, that's I don't know if you can see the chat. Sorry, I don't know if I'm saying that well. Did you take into account any reduction in population during the first year?
So our initial work on this has just assumed constant population and constant infrastructure. In reality, it's true. You would have lower population because of the inevitable fatalities of whatever the catastrophe was. Um, but you'd also have less infrastructure to be able to support feeding those people. So to simplify things, we've just assumed those two factors have canceled out. But we are currently working on updated models, which would actually take into account the reduction in population and the reduction in infrastructure. And I think this is kind of a systems connection here that our draft on this indicates that if you might have a 3% direct destruction of infrastructure, say from a nuclear war, but the actual reduction in industrial output could be more like 30% because of all the interconnected supply chains. So it is very important to take into account the cascading impacts.
Great, thank you. Next one's from Russell P. And so Russell's just questioning whether the security of food supplies is being considered during the modeling.
What do you mean by security?
So, it's Russell here. So, yeah, just curious because, when you go into degraded mode, society and law and order and stuff like that can break down sometimes. Just wondering if those factors are being considered and if you're re-establishing food supplies, building infrastructure, how to secure them and distribute them, basically.
Yeah, so generally we are not considering the scenario where it's just chaos and people are fighting each other and stealing food and everything like that. Uh, Not that that couldn't happen, but that one, it's much easier to model what might happen if people are actually cooperating. But the other thing is that we think if we can show that we could feed everyone if we cooperated, then it's more likely we would actually cooperate. Uh, However, we have considered the possibility, as I mentioned, of loss of international food trade. Um, but it could be much worse than that. It could be that you lose other trade and not just food, like seeds and fuel and equipment. Um, and and that makes things much worse. And you could also have loss of cooperation inside countries, which would make things much worse. So, yeah, I think we hope to eventually get into more of those scenarios, but we haven't really at this point.
Awesome. Thank you.
Another one from Catherine. So Catherine's just wondering, just in terms of major sunlight loss, whether you've considered the loss of resources like wood and leaves from other things in ecosystems consuming them too.
Yeah, so there's kind of two questions. How much is available at the time of the catastrophe that could be utilized versus how much would actually have continued production? And in the case of the first one, how much is available at that time, there aren't that many leaves. You know, the actual biomass of leaves is not that much, but the biomass of wood is very large, hundreds of billions of tons. And so, and a lot of the trees would be killed anyway by the catastrophe. So I think that we're not really going to be constrained by the resource in that case. Uh, and similarly, we look at like fossil fuels. Well, it would be hard to scale up the current production of fossil fuels, but we probably have some production that could potentially be used for production of fuel, like the natural gas, or sorry, the production of food, if we're using natural gas to turn into protein. Um, and then in terms of how much would be continuously produced, that's yeah, that's going to be much less. So I gave the example of food production might be 90% less, but that's if you don't relocate crops. If you relocate crops, you can reduce that reduction. So it would be something like 80% reduction, I think is what we're getting in our latest paper. So basically, you're doubling how much food can be produced just by moving crops to climates that they're better suited for. And even that sounds really bad, but you need to keep in mind that right now we produce about 2.5 times as much food as we need to feed everyone in the world, because so much goes to biofuels and waste and animals. And so even with 80% reduction in food supply, that still feeds a lot of people. And then you add in these other resilient foods, and that's why we think it can still work out to feed everyone.
Right. Um, I've got one just on, I guess, our current food supply chain. I guess if we waited to implement all of this, um, just after a disaster happens, we're already very much on the back foot. And so I guess it's almost like a two-pronged question. Like, is there the work that's being done by you and the team already being implemented to prepare ourselves for any catastrophes happening? And actually, is it doing things to support, I guess, a more sustainable food supply chain? Because obviously current practices in some areas aren't considered too sustainable with the growing population that we currently see?
So it would certainly be great if we increased the production of these resilient foods ahead of time. Um, Seaweed in particular has a lot of advantages. Like you don't need fertilizers and pesticides to grow, and in fact, you can actually reduce eutrophication, which is having too much nutrients in the ocean. That can be an environmental benefit. Also, there are some studies that show that feeding a little bit of the right type of seaweed to ruminants like cows, sheep, and goats uh, reduce their methane emissions. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So, yeah, there are a lot of reasons to do more seaweed now. And if we did that, then it would make it easier in a catastrophe. Some other things that are environmental now, using natural gas that is just going to be flared because it's like too far away from market, and it's just going to be burned. Well, you might as well get some food out of that. Um, and so that's kind of like zero carbon food because you were going to burn it anyway. Also, just the general idea of utilizing waste better. You know, if you can get some leaf protein from the plants that you are already growing anyway, or utilizing logging residues for food or energy. These are all sustainable things that might be a good idea to do ahead of the catastrophe. Um, However, we also want to be ready, even if we don't scale up these things. And yes, it's definitely harder, but we're trying to we think it's still feasible if we respond really quickly and if we cooperate. And so that's why we're trying to work with companies and governments to say, well, you don't have to spend billions of dollars now, but at least just think about it. Think about how you would do it. Maybe pre-approve the construction of factories so that we're not slowed down by that, because that was something that happened in COVID. So we're looking for really low cost options that are more likely to be adopted, that would really help us out in a catastrophe.
Great, thank you. Just opening up to the floor. Does anyone have any other questions for David?
I have a question around the fact that you're obviously doing some quite complex analysis and bringing in lots of different aspects of the whole sort of system solution. Are there any particular approaches or tools or anything like that that you're using or that your researchers are using to conduct that kind of analysis?
Yeah, well, I do actually credit my engineering science background as helping to think about, because this work involves so many different disciplines, and thinking about the big picture and the interaction. Um, One thing I didn't get to mention, uh, I might be able to reshare here, uh, was some work we did for NASA. And because basically they're interested in feeding people in space, but there are some overlaps in what you might want to do in space versus what would be good in a catastrophe. And one of those is the hydrogen single cell protein. And another one is using direct chemical synthesis. But anyway, this was a diagram from one of our papers related to space, and we showed how this basically you can have a closed loop, because right now they just do packaged food, and then they just have to get rid of the waste from that. But it would make more sense to have a closed loop where the CO2 that the astronauts are breathing out is then used to grow the food. And the kind of obvious thing is, oh, well, we'll just grow food with artificial light, um, like plants. But it turns out that that's really inefficient. So you want to use something else that's much more efficient at converting energy, like hydrogen single cell protein. And we've worked out, well, yeah, you probably can't just eat these hydrogen microbes. But even if you could cut down the amount of other food you'd have to bring by a factor of two, that's still a huge cost and weight savings. Yeah, so definitely trying to look at the big picture and interactions and systems thinking has been helpful in this project.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Anyone else have any questions for David?
Yeah, I was trying to find a diagram. Doesn't look like I have it in this version of the presentation, but it was one where we showed that the waste product from one process could then be used for the input of another process. So that's kind of systems thinking. And like one example was if you have wood, you could grow mushrooms on wood, but then the waste from that could actually be fed to ruminants like cows, um, because there would still be digestible material in that waste product. And another example was like at the household level, if you can do this leaf protein concentrate, but then the waste product from that could be given to mushrooms or could be fed to rabbits or things like that. So, yeah, I think it's very important when you have basically a resource constraint like this to think about how to utilize the waste products as a benefit rather than a liability.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'll just kind of ask just around the table again. Just anyone have any kind of final questions for David while he's here? All right, I think that's everything. Thanks so much for taking the time to present to us today, David, and an incredibly interesting and broad topic as well. So yeah, very, very, very eye-opening. So yeah, thanks again, and yeah, looking forward to, I guess, keeping tags and seeing how this work is progressing over the next kind of couple of months, couple of years.
Yeah, well, thanks again for the opportunity to speak and lots of great questions.
Great. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much again.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, David.
Thank you all.
See ya.